In this video, I will discuss how to write a philosophy paper. There are multiple ways to write a philosophy paper, but I will discuss a basic form that can guide and provide you with the tools to write a philosophy paper in the analytic tradition of philosophy. This form is applicable whether you write a short paper, long paper, a thesis, or a paper you write for publication. So what is the purpose of writing a philosophy paper? There are several reasons, but the most important ones are to develop critical and analytical thinking skills, help you acquire an understanding of important philosophical issues, make you better at presenting and evaluating arguments, and also develop your writing abilities and make you a better writer. There are multiple types of papers. I will mention three types: the descriptive paper, the expository paper, and the argumentative paper. Descriptive papers describe something. They can describe experiences, phenomena, situations, persons, and places. This type of paper allows for a great deal of freedom, and the goal is to describe something. The expository essay presents and explains an argument or set of ideas without critically evaluating them. It provides a clear, focused explanation of a particular topic, process, or set of ideas. For example, a thesis of an expository paper could be Socrates claims that justice is an excellence of the soul in Plato's Republic. In this paper, for example, you present and explain Socrates' view on justice. The argumentative paper. This is the type of paper you will be expected to write in a philosophy class. An argumentative paper presents and explains an argument or set of arguments and then critically evaluates them for philosophical soundness. You either present objections or defend the argument against objections. An argumentative paper is similar to expository paper, but an argumentative paper involves more research, and you should present your own thesis, your own position on the topic. So while in an expository essay you will introduce a topic and explain it, in an argumentative essay you will introduce your own argument, your own position on the topic. And you should try to convince the reader to accept your position. So, a philosophy paper in the analytic tradition is an argumentative paper. The primary focus of a philosophy paper is the argument. An argument is not merely a disagreement between people. An argument is a set of premises or reasons that are presented as support for believing a conclusion. You must provide some good reasons for believing a certain claim. The goal of a good argument is to present and defend true conclusions. There are different types of argumentative papers. I will mention three options, but of course there are more. One option is that you can compare and discuss two or more different arguments on a given issue. Think about which of the positions you find more persuasive and why. Analyze the arguments and discuss why one position is better than the other. You can also contrast the strengths and weaknesses of two opposing views. Another type of paper could be where you choose an influential argument and you can defend or argue against that argument or position. So you could criticize an argument or show that certain arguments for the thesis are no good. You can also defend an argument against someone else's criticism. You can offer counterexamples to a certain thesis or argument. Another option is that you could present your own argument for your own conclusion about a given subject. So let's discuss this thesis. Every philosophy paper should contain a clearly articulated thesis. Your thesis is the central or overall claim that you are going to argue for. That is, your thesis should clearly state the position that you are going to endorse in your paper. For instance, I will argue that libertarian free will is an impossibility, whether determinism is true or not. Another example of a thesis is I will argue that anti-abortion claims hold inconsistent moral beliefs. Another example of an argumentative thesis for a paper assignment that asks you to present and critically evaluate Kant's moral theory could be I will argue that Kant fails to give a compelling argument for unconditional and universal morals that one should follow at all times in all situations. I would like to give you a few tips, a few recommendations on how to choose a thesis. So first, you should choose a specific and modest topic rather than a very broad one. For a broad topic, you have to cover a very large literature. People often attempt to accomplish too much in a philosophy paper. The usual result of this is a paper that's hard to read and which is not well defended, and the claims are poorly explained. So don't be overambitious. Don't try to establish any earth-shattering conclusions in your 10 to 15-page paper. Do not choose a very complex topic. For example, what is justice? Again, it will require you to cover a very large literature and you will not be able to accomplish it in a short paper. It is important that your topic will have context. You should always start to discuss the issue and relate to existing research on the issue. While you have to show that your research builds on otherwise existing research, try to make an original contribution. By original contribution, it means that your paper has to show some independent thinking. This doesn't mean you have to come up with your own theory or that you have to make a completely original contribution to human thought or break completely new ground. An ideal paper will contain thoughtful critical responses to the topic you write about. So try to come up with your own arguments or your own way of elaborating or criticizing or defending an argument you discuss in your paper. So how could you choose a thesis and make an original contribution? Try to identify a niche. That is, identify an issue within that research topic that demands attention, and then occupy that niche and show how you are going to address that issue. How could you find or identify a niche? You could argue that a previous research is wrong. You could indicate a gap in a previous research or an issue that was not covered or addressed. You could also raise a question about a previous research without arguing that it is completely wrong. And you can also continue a tradition that a previous research has started, but now there are new circumstances or a new situation that changes the previous conclusion. Before you start writing your paper, it's very important that you make an outline. Your outline should include a thesis. The thesis is the main argument you want to advance, arguments that support your thesis, examples that clarify your arguments, counterarguments, responses to counterarguments, and conclusions. Later I will talk about counterarguments, responses to counterarguments, and explain that. So writing an outline will help you organize your thoughts, and you will be able to evaluate your arguments and see if they support your thesis. An outline will also make it clear what the structure of the paper is and how you should organize your arguments. So while you work on your outline, you could ask some questions to help you organize it, such as, in what order should I explain the various terms and positions that I will be discussing? At what point should I present my opponent's positions or arguments? In what order should I offer my criticism? The overall clarity of your paper will greatly depend on its structure. Therefore, it is very important to think about these questions before you begin to write. If you have a good outline, the rest of the writing process will be much easier. The structure of your paper is very important. It is important that it will be clear to the reader. Your reader should not have to exert any effort to figure it out, to understand how one argument is connected to the next one, or how the arguments support the thesis. So, the most philosophy papers have the same following kind of structure, and I recommend that you have that too. You will start with the introduction, then the body of the paper, that will include arguments that support the thesis, examples, counter-arguments, responses to counter-arguments, and then you end the paper with conclusions. So I will talk later about the counter-arguments and responses to counter-arguments and explain that. But you can see that the outline, the structure of the outline is the same as the structure of your paper. So let's discuss the introduction. The introduction of your paper should range from one paragraph to a page or two, depending on the length of the paper. If the paper is short, it should be only one paragraph. If the paper is long, it could be one page. The introduction should introduce the problem or question that your paper addresses. You could also discuss how you plan to address it and why it is worth addressing in the first place. State your main thesis and what it is that you will be arguing for, what your position would be. Briefly outline the arguments that support your thesis and discuss the structure of your paper. Explain the order in which you will argue for various points and explain how all those points come together in support of your thesis. In some papers, it's important that you provide background information. While you may know everything about this topic, it may be new to your readers. Background information may include history, definitions, and any other information that the reader needs to know in order to understand your topic and your approach. A few more tips about the introduction. Your introduction should capture the reader's interest. It should bring immediate focus to your subject. You may want to start with a provocative question, a brief anecdote, a thought experiment, a startling statement, or a combination of these. These types of hooks will get your readers more engaged with your topic. Avoid abstract or empty sentences. I would not start by asserting that the research topic is important, and I would not make some kind of generalizations about the research topic. Also, there is no need to describe the argument. That is, I would not start with a sentence such as, I will describe the argument that discusses this and that, but I will inform the reader right away with the argument of the paper. After the introduction, you have the body of the paper, and the body of the paper should include a short exposition of the arguments to be discussed, unless you already mentioned this in the introduction. Your own arguments in support of your thesis. And it is very important to include examples that clarify and support your thesis. Many of the claims philosophers make are very abstract and hard to understand, and examples are the best way to make those claims clearer. Then discuss potential objections and counter-arguments to your thesis, and then this part ends with your responses to the counter-arguments. It is very important that you divide the body of the paper into different paragraphs. Each paragraph should present only a single idea or set of related ideas. If you are going to make a new point, then start a new paragraph. Be careful about jumping too quickly from one point to the next or mixing too many issues together. New or different topics should be gathered together and put into another paragraph. So every time you are going to make a new point, again, start a new paragraph. Each paragraph should bring your reader one step closer to accepting your thesis and the logic of your arguments. As for the paragraphs, each paragraph in the body of the paper must have a clear argument, and the argument has to relate to the main thesis of the paper. You should introduce the argument at the beginning of the paragraph, where it can help the reader understand how the point fits into the purpose of the paper. The rest of the paragraph is to support the argument with evidence, explanations, and citations from the text. It is also important to explain how and why the evidence supports the argument. Each paragraph should have a cohesive unity that resembles a well-written paper. Use transitions and connect your paragraphs in a logical way to make it clear to your reader how a paragraph is related to the previous or next paragraph. You can connect paragraphs by something like, having discussed X, I will now consider Y. Or now that we have seen X, the next issue that needs to be addressed is Y. Transition sentences clarify the connection between the arguments and help the reader see the development of points in the paper. In a philosophy paper, you should strive to state the arguments with as much clarity and precision as you can, whether it is your own position or someone else's. Use short and simple sentences. Try to come up with your own arguments or your own way of elaborating, criticizing, or defending arguments related to your thesis. Just summarizing what others have said won't be enough. If you are reconstructing someone else's argument in order to refute it, your evaluations will be stronger if you give the most charitable and accurate argument on their behalf that you can. New terms need to be explained. A common mistake in philosophy papers is a failure to explain important concepts and arguments. You should always make it clear how you understand these notions. Even if they are familiar from everyday discourse, philosophers use words in a different way from the way they are usually used. So, as a writer, you have to give your readers a sense of what you mean by the words you use. For example, suppose you are writing a paper about abortion, and you want to assert the claim, a fetus is a person. You have to explain what you mean by a person. Philosophers define a person differently, and this could change the way we understand your argument and whether we accept your thesis or not. Okay, so now we come to talk about objections and counter-arguments. This is a very important part of the paper, and many students skip this part. A good philosophy paper will address potential objections. That is, objections to your own arguments. It is better to bring up an objection yourself than to hope that your reader won't think of it. That is, try to anticipate objections to your view and respond to them. Explain how you think these objections can be countered or overcome. Of course, sometimes there is no way to deal with all the objections someone might raise, so concentrate on the ones that seem strongest or most pressing. When you address the opposing arguments, you show that you know the literature very well and illustrate a very well understanding of the topic. You demonstrate a lack of bias and enhance the level of trust that the reader has for both you and your opinion. You also strengthen your argument by diminishing your opposition's argument. So you establish yourself as a very strong writer and will make your thesis more convincing. But how can you accomplish this? How can you anticipate potential objections? So you can address the other side of the argument, put yourself in their shoes, try to understand where they are coming from. Look at the reasons you provided and try to argue with yourself. Ask, why would someone disagree with each of these points? Sometimes it's helpful to imagine that you are having a verbal argument with someone who disagrees with you. Find the necessary facts, evidence, quotes from experts, etc., to refute the points that your oppositions might make. A good method to think about yourself is like you're a child, asking your parents for a permission to do something that they would normally say no. You were far more likely to get them to say yes if you anticipated and addressed all of their concerns before they expressed them. You did not want to belittle these concerns because this only puts them on the defensive and lead to a conclusion that went against your wishes. The same is true in your writing. The last part of the paper is conclusion. Your conclusion should contain no surprises. That is, try to avoid bringing up new issues, new criticisms, or different comments that belong in the exposition or in the body of the paper. The conclusion should, for the most part, restate the thesis and the central arguments of the paper. So, in the conclusion, restate your thesis and summarize your arguments. Discuss the implications and/or limitations of your arguments. You might end up by pointing to some questions that your argument raises, or some of the issues that your paper leaves unresolved, or discuss what consequences the thesis would have. It is also important that there will be a sense of closure. Make sure that the reader has a distinct sense that the paper has come to an end. I would like now to discuss a few recommendations on what you should avoid in your paper. Don't begin your paper with a sentence like, "Down through the ages, philosophers have dealt with the problem of justice." There is no need to warm up to your topic. You should get right to the point with the first sentence. In the introduction, but not only in the introduction, avoid cliches, abstract or empty sentences like, "For thousands of years, philosophers have wondered about this or that." Or, "I will then describe the argument that Kant gives for its conclusion." Instead, provide a brief and specific statement of the argument. This will inform the reader better about the subject of the paper. Also, avoid wordy and clumsy sentences. Try to be precise and write concise sentences. Wordiness shows lack of professionalism, that you try to impress, but this might cover problems with your thesis or arguments. Avoid passive voice. This is the rule in English academic writing. In other cultures, the rule is different. For example, in German academic writing, it is considered better to write in a passive voice. However, an active voice makes the writing less wordy, clearer, and less confusing for the readers. First and second person pronouns, such as I or we, may be suitable for reporting research results or case studies. The pronoun you is usually inappropriate. Also, avoid the use of man, mankind, he, him, and his when you mean to include all humans. Do not use excessive quotations, because this shows that you did not find your own voice and you rely too much on quotations. Quotations should never be used as a substitute for your own explanations. And when you do quote an author, you still have to explain what the quotation says in your own words. If the quoted passage contains an argument, reconstruct the argument in more explicit, straightforward terms. Avoid autobiographical details about your own experience in writing the paper. So comments like, "I had a hard time reading this or that," have no place in academic papers. Do not present open, unanswered, or rhetorical questions. Also, do not use weak qualifiers like "I believe," "I feel," "it is in my opinion," or "I think." Just tell us. You are the author of the paper, so it goes without saying that the claims made are yours, with the exception, of course, of quotes and paraphrases. Adding that a claim is your opinion usually doesn't inform your reader of anything new. Do not evaluate the author's arguments and writings. So comments like, "The argument is clearly stated and well written," are not appropriate for a philosophy paper. Do not misrepresent an author's reasoning. If you are reconstructing someone else's argument, your evaluations will be stronger if you give the most charitable and accurate argument on their behalf. It is also important to mention that quoting the dictionary definition of terms from Webster's or another dictionary is usually not appropriate for a philosophy paper. The philosophical use of a term is often not captured by a standard dictionary definition. Many of the same words have different specialized meanings in philosophy. Don't discuss philosophical works, even ancient ones, in past tense, but in the present tense. Aristotle, for instance, has long been dead, but the text which contains his arguments is still with us. The ideas in it are read and understood in the present. So write Aristotle argues rather than Aristotle argued. Finally, to write a good philosophy paper, you need to be concise, but at the same time, explain yourself fully. Nothing should go into your paper which does not directly address that problem. It is always better to concentrate on 1 or 2 points and develop them in depth than to try to cram in too much. Be sure that everything you write is relevant to the central problem. In addition, be sure to say in the paper how it is relevant. Don't make your reader guess. When you have a good point, explain it. Give an example. Make it clear how the point helps your argument. So the last thing is the citations. Include citations within the paper for each time you borrow ideas or facts. Include a bibliography or a list of references which cites all your sources. Use a standard format for citing your sources. The easiest method of citation is the Modern Language Association or Chicago style.